Today, we're going to analyze one of the world's most important strategic partnerships that you probably never think about: Mexico and the United States. They share a nearly 2,000-mile border, which has led to the two nations having long-standing close trade, cultural, and demographic ties. If these two countries are able to solve their biggest problems and successfully cooperate, they're in a unique position now to decrease the world's reliance on communist authoritarian China. In 2018, trade between the two countries totaled $671 billion, which is a lot of billions, and it makes Mexico the United States' second largest trading partner in the world. We gave them Coca-Cola, they gave us breakfast burritos. But there is one big threat to this important partnership: the powerful Mexican transnational criminal organizations, the cartels. According to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security study on binational criminal proceeds, Mexican cartels earn between $19 and $29 billion each year. I think we're finally at a point where these cartels should be defined as a commercial insurgency and major threat to the U.S. national security interests, but maybe not in the ways you might think. In this video, we'll also analyze the reasons why bilateral cooperation between these two great nations has recently started falling apart, and the steps that we might be able to take to improve those relations. A lot of people don't realize just how important this partnership between the US and Mexico truly is. What affects one of us ends up affecting both of us. Mexico's population is 126.7 million people, and their landmass is about 20% the size of the United States. Despite their cartel problems, Mexico is still incredibly successful by many metrics. Their $2.4 trillion in annual GDP is the world's 13th largest economy by purchasing power parity, according to the International Monetary Fund. Mexico regularly ranks among the most cost-effective places to locate manufacturing operations in the world, which means much of the manufacturing that is now leaving China is headed to base their operations in Mexico because the labor is better skilled and the costs are lower. This means Mexico is a potential partner in the future to help check and balance China's manufacturing power and influence. Geopolitical expert Peter Zion put it great during his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience when he said this:
"If Americans start to think of Mexicans as drug runners again, regardless of why, that damages our most productive trading relationship and our most brilliant opportunity for our future right out of the gate."
But I think it's important for us to try to understand how these two countries could find new ways to cooperate to solve this cartel problem that really should be a common enemy to unite against. Nothing creates strong bonds and friendships like mutually disliking someone. So why do I think Mexican cartels qualify as a commercial insurgency? Commercial insurgencies are defined as widespread and sustained criminal activity with a political dimension that challenges the security of the state. And as a group, they implement coercion and violence to influence economics, politics, the military, and information media in order to profit from illicit activity. Mexican cartels have the same fundamental characteristics in that these criminal groups implement organized attacks to challenge political control of a region and attempt to subvert control of an established government. According to this congressional research report, political violence leading up to Mexico's term elections in 2021 saw more than 100 politicians killed and many more threatened, showing how the cartel has taken direct electoral interference to an insurgency level. On January 6, 2023, the Mexican military sent 3,000 soldiers to capture El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman, in the city of Culiacan. Gang members set fire to vehicles and used them as roadblocks while shooting .50 caliber rifles at military and civilian aircraft, shutting down the local airport for the entire day. Mexican military helicopters rained down heavy machine gun fire onto the Sinaloa cartel gang members. Ovidio Guzman was captured and sent to face justice in Mexico City, but it came at the cost of 10 brave Mexican soldiers who were KIA, an additional 35 injured, 19 enemy cartel members were taken out, and 21 more were arrested. According to Mexico's defense minister, Mexican cartels have expanded into a strategic regional security threat for the United States of America. On January 7th, a Mexican federal judge halted the extradition of El Chapo Guzman's son back to the United States, raising questions about if the cartel is able to intimidate the justice system in the country. At least they didn't just free him from custody like they did last time they caught him in 2019. But good luck reporting on this, because assassinations of journalists and media personnel have made Mexico one of the world's most dangerous countries in which to practice journalism. In the first 5 months of 2022, 11 journalists were murdered by the cartel in Mexico. Friendly reminder, I'm not a journalist, just a dummy that makes YouTube videos, and if I ever visit Tijuana, please don't kidnap me. But these Mexican cartels are a major force driving the US drug overdose epidemic. The US annually seizes around 1.5 million pounds of cocaine and 680,000 pounds of methamphetamine. According to the US Department of Justice, Mexican cartels traffic the majority of illicit narcotics into the US, which experienced over 100,000 overdoses in 2021, making drug poisoning the leading cause of incident death in the US. It's estimated that the impact of overdoses from illicit substances on American society cost the US economy approximately $1 trillion in 2021. Now, of course, there are many counters to this perspective, and I'll bring them up to add a little bit of nuance and counterpoints to this viewpoint. Sure, you could argue that it's the United States' demand for these substances that is driving the problem. If we weren't over there buying this stuff, then they wouldn't be busy trying to meet the demand and supplying it to us, right? Heroin use has increased 10% per year between 2010 and 2016. But unfortunately, the debate about how to best address the war on drugs has evolved and transcended. It's moved far beyond all of that, because now these criminal cartels have apparently read some business books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and they've diversified their revenue streams. Illicit substances aren't even the cartel's top source of revenue anymore. Alejandro Castillo, the Mexican government's special envoy sent to restore the rule in Michoacan, said the country's 12 major cartels use illegal mining and extortion as their biggest moneymakers now. They're a commercial insurgency because they're here to stay, even if the war on drugs were to be solved tomorrow.
You may have seen the avocados from Mexico commercial during the Super Bowl. Remember them? What the ad doesn't tell you is that a Mexican drug cartel infiltrated the country's avocado industry, now controls a local trade from production to distribution.
But either way, efforts to address the threat within anti-cartel operations have been limited by recent poor US-Mexican relations, which get in the way of meaningful bilateral cooperation to strengthen regional security. US officials report a total lack of engagement from their Mexican counterparts. That has only increased over the last 3 years. The reason for this was an October 2020 incident where the United States arrested a retired Mexican Army general, Salvador Cienfuegos, for alleged involvement with the Beltran-Levy cartel. This act severely damaged US-Mexico relations and crippled counter-narcotics cooperation between the two nations. Even if the guy was guilty of working with the cartels, the downside of arresting him was definitely not worth it. The US government seems to agree with this assessment, as they completely dropped the charges against the high-profile former Mexican Army general. But the problem is the diplomatic damage was already done, with DEA officials anonymously indicating what fragile links existed beforehand are now completely severed. So both the United States and Mexico have made moves that have hurt the trust between them. So while it might sound like Mexico's going up in flames, in reality it's mainly cartel on cartel violence. The cartel problem is a major threat to US interests, because the US is one of the top foreign investors in Mexico. US companies have invested over $100 billion in Mexico, representing around 39.1% of all inflows, according to Mexico's Secretariat of Economy. The money is mainly spent in the manufacturing and professional services sectors. This kind of cooperation in the future is going to be very strategically important as the United States seeks to limit their exposure to manufacturing in China. Most people think the threat is with spillover violence from the cartels into the US homeland. But according to the 2022 DEA National Threat Assessment, that is in dire need of a graphics artist for their front page, the Drug Enforcement Agency themselves said, quote, "While direct related violence in Mexico remains a concern, there is minimal spillover violence into the United States, as US-based Mexican transnational criminal organizations generally refrain from inter-cartel violence to avoid detection and increased scrutiny by law enforcement." Of course, that's tough to tell someone who has personally been affected by this kind of crime, but emotions aside, cartel-related attacks do not normally occur within the US. However, the DEA did find that the Mexican cartels are operating in at least 60 different American cities, from Florida to Bellingham, Washington. And Charles Marino, a former advisor to the Department of Homeland Security, believes this might change. He said, quote, "My expert opinion is that we're going to see an increase in cartel violence within the United States in all of its forms. So the debate is far from settled. The real threat is economic. The real threat is to the Mexico-United States partnership that could undermine authoritarian communist China. Another key factor that supports my theory that Mexican cartels are a commercial insurgency is that they seek to control key geographic areas by force in order to conduct illicit activity. They do this in 3 operational zones. First, sourcing production. Second, transportation. And finally, distribution. They routinely engage in attacks against government forces and rival criminal groups to expand and protect their operations. Recent reporting estimates that approximately 60% of Mexican territory is controlled by cartels and experiences a high level of attacks, while approximately 25% of Mexican territory experiences a medium level of attacks, where control between the government and cartels is disputed. A 2019 evaluation on insecurity and violence conducted by the Mexican federal government assessed the state capacity to provide basic services such as domestic security had collapsed across 70% of Mexican territory. Cartels have started setting up roadblocks to extort money from the residents. They're basically collecting taxes. This isn't to say the United States doesn't have their own national security problem with gang violence, which accounts for a whopping 48.9% of all violent crime in the US. No, what I'm saying is better cooperation between the US and Mexico could help decrease the problem for both countries. The threat of Mexican cartels behaving like commercial insurgencies needs to be solved for both countries to flourish. But finding the right approach has been admittedly very difficult, to say the least. But it's not for lack of trying. For instance, the first official action by the Mexican military against the cartels started on December 11, 2006, when the newly elected Mexican president Felipe Calderon sent 6,500 federal troops into Michoacan to put an end to the drug cartel there. This is where Mexico's war on drugs really began, and since then, thousands of Mexican politicians, students, and journalists have met their untimely end in the conflict each year. In 2007, the United States started to help in Mexico's war on drugs, and the two took a very militaristic approach. They started something called the Mexican Initiative, which assists Mexican security forces and trains them and equips them in ways to fight corruption and criminal organizations. The US has spent about $3 billion since then on the Mexican Initiative, but it's only really left the cartels fractured into 150 different organized crime gangs instead of the handful that they were before. They did this in order to avoid capture. Is the military approach to fighting the war on drugs not a viable solution then? Since 2006, Mexico has seen more than 360,000 homicides, and the rate continues to increase each year. The Mexican Initiative is being replaced by the US-Mexico Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communications. Way less catchy. But it'll have more of a focus on economic development instead of providing defense and security training, which, as we've seen, is kind of the rage these days. It remains to be seen if this less militaristic approach will fare any better. The second approach by Mexico was to do essentially a complete 180 reversal to the military vibe and deploy the hippie love approach instead. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but this new approach comes from the new Mexican president, López Obrador's decision to avoid what he calls mistakes of previous administrations that failed to contain cartel violence with a military-led crackdown on gangs. Obrador said, quote, "Violence cannot be confronted with violence. Fire cannot be extinguished with fire. Evil cannot be confronted with evil." And the thing is, Obrador has a really good point here. The last approach did fail to stop the cartel, but it now appears that the new hugs not bullets approach has also failed. You might be surprised to learn that the Mexican military spends very little on defense each year at just 0.08% of total GDP, placing them near the very bottom of 144 out of 167 countries' defense spending worldwide. This is, of course, largely because Mexico has a strict non-interventionalist policy and they don't fight wars in foreign countries around the world, but I think Mexico needs to invest more in their military in order to see some noticeable security gains. This isn't to say that Mexican authorities aren't trying to defeat the cartel in their own way. The Mexican government disbanded the federal police, which was plagued with corruption accusations in 2019, and they established a joint National Guard command led by over 250 field-grade military officers, law enforcement officials, and federal investigators, as well as over 80,000 soldiers. According to the CIA World Factbook, in September of 2022, complete control of the Guard was handed over to the Mexican army. The commanding officers are personally selected and trusted by Mexico's president, Obrador, and troop deployments have been scheduled across 150 of Mexico's 266 state regions. However, reports indicate that only approximately 50% of Joint Command bases are operational, and the troops' mission is only to limit instances of cartel violence instead of attempting to dismantle and totally defeat their commercial insurgency. And the new National Guard only has several hundred investigators, while the federal police had 10,000, according to an anonymous US government official. Supporting this claim, though, is an analysis of government data that shows even though the National Guard is triple the size of the old federal police, they've only made 8,000 arrests in 2021 compared to the 21,700 arrests made by the federal police in 2018. But if the cartel is an insurgency, how do you defeat them? And when you take out the leadership of, say, the Sinaloa cartel like El Chapo and his son, who will replace them? Someone less lethal, or potentially someone much, much worse. The Jalisco cartel is the rival gang that shows themselves off in promotional videos to be even more militaristic, sporting armored vehicles, decked out in tactical gear from head to toe. They look more squared away than I did when I was in the US Army. In certain instances, we see Mexican cartels regulate social relationships by enforcing codes of conduct in the areas they control, even distributing ideological literature. Their members exhibit a group identity, they call it narco culture. It's done through the practice of ritualistic behavior where they worship martyrs and famed cartel members like Pablo Escobar. They're clearly a commercial insurgency because we've seen Mexican cartels have engaged in information operations by advertising themselves on billboards in public in broad daylight, describing themselves as oppressed and humiliated workers who have been marginalized by unjust systems of power. On July 28, 2010, billboard advertisements appeared throughout the city capital that stated that the people supported the local cartel family. The Jalisco cartel implements asymmetric tactics in clandestine covert and overt operations employing weaponized unmanned drones, IEDs, custom-built armored vehicles, and terror tactics against their adversaries. The commercial insurgency cartels are comparable to historical instances of widespread piracy and banditry. I mean that in the sense that these kind of activities have traditionally been regarded as national security threats because of their negative impact on commerce, public order, public safety, and state capacity to rule. But more importantly, because they can be considered as a precursor to the collapse of governance and revolution. It's been suggested the United States should officially recognize cartels as a foreign terrorist organization, but I don't agree. That move would further alienate Mexico. On top of that, these criminal groups do not appear to be solely politically or ideologically motivated, which is an important element to define a terrorist organization. However, on the other hand, the resources that would become available if they were recognized as a terrorist organization could be of great benefit. On January 22, 2022, the Mexican army claimed they were attacked by pro-Jalisco cartel residents in the town of Lomas Blancas, wounding 10 Mexican soldiers. Mexican troops were able to detain 9 suspected cartel members and confiscated many rifles and high-speed, low-drag tactical gear that actually had Jalisco cartel logos on it. Clearly, another criteria for commercial insurgency should be whether or not they have their own commercial brand logos on their gear. In certain instances, it is similar to the threat posed by civil wars, as Mexican transnational criminal organizations exercise control through paramilitary forces that rival the power of government security forces. In order to defeat a commercial insurgency like the Mexican cartels, you need to focus on what is important to them, which is their revenue streams. Unlike traditional insurgencies, they aren't as focused on politics or ideology. They don't care about control of the population as much. They're mainly focused on their dollar bills. Another recommendation is to strengthen border security to prevent the flow of illicit substances at that bottleneck. In 2018, President Trump first sent 5,000 troops to the border and declared the situation a national emergency. Since then, President Biden has continued the deployment of soldiers at the border and approved to extend their mission throughout 2023. U.S. Air Force General Glenn Valharrick is in charge of the U.S. military at the border, and he had a great recommendation of how to decrease cartel influence. He believes new technology like drones and sensors can help us solve the problems at the border. When Mexico and the United States work together, they're able to freeze cartel bank accounts, which is exactly the kind of move that builds trust. This is the kind of cooperation that Mexican President Obrador seems happy to work with the US government on. In 2020, Mexican officials and US drug agents teamed up to target nearly 2,000 different people and companies to freeze assets worth $1.1 billion belonging to the Jalisco cartel. Now, this is of course just a starting point, since it's estimated that the cartels earn about $13 billion per year in smuggling alone. It's my hope that the United States and Mexico can find new ways to work together to combat these cartels that have become commercial insurgencies. They are one of the greatest threats to one of the world's most important strategic partnerships. If you like this geopolitical rundown, please consider hitting the like button if you think I've earned it, and comment below with some possible solutions to the problem that maybe I missed. Thank you for watching. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, over and out.